The day Mamie Dugan walked into Hays City, Kansas, with nothing but the dress on her back and a jaw set hard enough to crack stone, every soul on the main thoroughfare turned to watch her pass, and not a single one of them dared offer her a hand. It was the summer of 1873, and the prairie heat pressed down on the town like a flat iron on cotton, warping the air above the rutted dirt street into shimmering waves that made the false-fronted buildings look like they were breathing. The cattle trade had brought money to Hays City, and money had brought saloons and gamblers and men with sharp eyes who measured everything they saw by what it might be worth to them. Mamie Dugan was 23 years old, Irish-born but Kansas-raised, with copper hair that the wind had pulled loose from its pins during the 3 miles she'd walked from the burned-out homestead east of town where she and her father had scratched out a living for 4 years. Her father was 2 days dead. The homestead was ash and splinter. And Mamie had exactly 14 cents in the pocket of her apron, which she had sewn herself from a flour sack, because real apron fabric cost money they'd never quite managed to have. She did not cry. She had cried at her father's grave, which she had dug herself because the nearest neighbor was 6 miles off and she had not been willing to wait. She had cried while she shoveled and while she smoothed the mound of dark earth and while she fashioned a cross from 2 fence posts lashed with leather cord. She had cried every tear she possessed, and when they ran dry, something inside her went quiet and hard and practical. She needed food. She needed work. She needed neither pity nor charity, which was just as well, because the world had never shown any great inclination to offer those things to a red-haired Irish girl with mud on her boots and pride in her spine. The first door she knocked on belonged to the millinery shop run by a woman named Mrs. Cartwright, a thin-mouthed woman of 50 who looked Mamie over with the particular expression of someone smelling something unpleasant. Mamie explained calmly that she was looking for work, that she could sew and press and trim hats, that she had helped her mother in a Dublin millinery shop before they emigrated when Mamie was 7. Mrs. Cartwright said she had all the help she needed, which was a lie, because Mamie could see through the glass behind the woman's shoulder an empty workbench covered in dust. The second door she tried was the general store, where a round-faced man named Potts listened to her with what seemed like genuine consideration before telling her the position had just been filled that morning. His eyes moved to Mamie's left hand as he said it, checking for a wedding ring that wasn't there, and Mamie understood then that the position had not been filled at all. The third door, the fourth, the fifth, the laundry, the hotel. The bakery that smelled of fresh bread so powerfully that Mamie's stomach contracted with a pain that was almost physical, a low, desperate clench that reminded her she had not eaten since yesterday morning. She held herself straight. She kept her voice level. She said the same words each time, that she was willing to work hard and she was asking for wages, not handouts, and each time some variation of the same answer came back to her. By the time the afternoon sun had tipped past its peak, Mamie had tried 11 establishments, and she was standing in the middle of the main street with her 14 cents and her empty stomach, and the particular white-knuckled dignity of a woman who is going to handle this on her own terms or not at all. A group of cowboys fresh off a cattle drive ambled past, and one of them tipped his hat with an offer that was not about employment, and Mamie looked at him with an expression so cold and direct that he actually took a step backward, which was satisfying in a minor way. It was then that she noticed the sign. It was new enough that the paint hadn't fully dried, and it hung above a storefront that was still in the process of becoming what it intended to be. Half the shelves inside were bare. Sawdust still covered the floor in patches. The sign read Donnelly Dry Goods and Feed in clean black letters, and beneath it, taped to the inside of the window glass in a hand that was neat without being fancy, was a smaller card, Help Wanted, Inquire Within. Mamie stood on the boardwalk and looked at that card for a long moment. Then she looked at the 14 cents in her palm. Then she squared her shoulders and pushed open the door. The inside of the store smelled of pine lumber and linseed oil, and the sharp mineral tang of new nails in open kegs. There were crates still nailed shut stacked along one wall, and bolts of fabric leaning against the counter that hadn't been shelved yet. And in the middle of all this organized chaos stood a man with his back to her, lifting a 50-pound sack of flour from a dolly and setting it with practiced ease onto a shelf. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He hadn't heard her come in over the sound of the flour sack landing on the shelf. "Excuse me," Mamie said. He turned around, and she had a half-second to form an impression before the conversation started. He was perhaps 28, with a square jaw and dark eyes and the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work, though his hands, she noticed, were not only calloused from labor, but also ink-stained at the fingertips, the mark of someone who kept accounts. There was a directness in his expression that she found immediately preferable to the evasion she'd been facing all day. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand rather than categorize. "I'm here about the position," Mamie said before he could speak. "I can stock shelves, keep accounts, serve customers, and I know dry goods from 6 years of watching my father run a supply operation on a working farm. I'm asking for fair wages for fair work. I'm not here looking for charity, and I'd appreciate if we kept it on a business footing from the start." Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like the adjustment a person makes when something doesn't fit the box they'd already started preparing. "Jedediah Donnelly," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and treated her hand the way he might have treated the hand of anyone he was conducting business with, which was the first genuinely respectful gesture she'd been offered all day. She felt something loosen slightly in her chest, though she kept her expression neutral. "Mamie Dugan," she said. "Miss Dugan," he said. "You mind me asking a few questions before we get to terms?" "That's the normal way of doing it," she said. His mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. "You mentioned accounts. Do you mean actual ledger work, figures?" "I mean I can add a column of numbers in my head faster than most men can do it with a pencil," she said. "My father taught me." He believed in it, said a woman who couldn't manage accounts was a woman at someone else's mercy her whole life. "Your father sounds like a smart man." "He was," Mamie said, and the past tense hung in the air between them for a moment, and she watched him hear it and understand and choose not to press it, which was another mark in his favor. "I need someone who can handle the counter while I'm managing receiving and stock," Jedediah said. "I need someone honest. This town has a short supply. I need someone who won't shortchange customers and won't let customers shortchange me." He paused. "I also need someone who can read and write clearly enough to manage order correspondence." "There's a fair bit of it. I read and write in English, and I have some Irish besides," Mamie said, "though I doubt the suppliers in St. Louis are writing to you in Irish." That almost smile appeared again, slightly wider. "They are not," he agreed. $1.50 a week to start, 6 days, 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening. If the store does well, I'll revisit the rate at 3 months. $1.50 a week was fair. It was not generous, but it was fair, and more to the point, it was honest. Mamie looked at him steadily. "Do we have an agreement?" "We do," Jedediah said. "Can you start Monday?" "I can start right now," Mamie said, and nodded toward the crates. "Those bolts of fabric aren't going to shelve themselves, and if you leave new calico in a pile on the floor, it picks up sawdust and customers won't buy it." He looked at her for a moment, and this time the almost smile became a real one, brief and genuine and slightly startled. "Monday is fine," he said. "You'll want to get settled first." Mamie had not mentioned that she had nowhere to be settled into. The conversation had gone the direction she'd needed it to go, which was toward employment, and she saw no reason to muddy it with circumstances that were hers to manage alone. "Monday, then," she said, and they shook on it again. She found a room that night in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Haverson, who charged $2 a week including breakfast and supper. It was more than Mamie had, but Mrs. Haverson, who was a pragmatic woman rather than a charitable one, accepted Mamie's first week on credit against her first week's wages, which suited Mamie's preference for transactions over kindness just fine. The room was small, with a single window that looked over the alley and a rope bed with a straw mattress that crackled when she sat on it. Mamie sat on the edge of that mattress in the fading evening light and let herself be still for the first time in 3 days. Her father's face came to her. Patrick Dugan, who had crossed an ocean and built a life with nothing and taught his daughter to count and read and stand straight and never, ever let anyone see the bottom of what you were carrying. She pressed her palms flat on her knees and breathed slowly. She was alive. She had work starting Monday. She had a roof. She had done it herself. That mattered more than she could have explained to anyone who hadn't needed it to matter. Monday morning came in cool and bright. The Kansas sky that particular shade of cloudless blue that made the whole world seem scrubbed clean. Mamie arrived at Donnelly's dry goods and feed at 10 minutes before 7 o'clock, her hair pinned neatly, her dress brushed as clean as it was going to get, her 14 cents now 12 because she'd bought a corn cake on Sunday. Jedediah was already inside, and he opened the door at her knock with the air of a man who had been at work for some time already. He showed her the layout of the store, which he'd organized while finishing the setup over the weekend. The dry goods occupied the left side, bolts of fabric and thread and buttons and ribbon and notions all sorted and labeled in his neat hand. The feed and seed occupied the right side and the back, heavy and functional. In the center was the counter with the till, a scale, and the ledger books. Behind the counter was a small office space partitioned by a half wall where the correspondence sat in careful stacks. "The pricing is all in here," he said, showing her the master ledger. "Every item, every price, every supplier. If someone asks for something we don't carry, write it down with the date. I review it weekly and decide what to order. And if someone tries to negotiate a price, everything has a posted price. I don't negotiate down and I don't inflate up. Same price for everyone." He said it plainly as though it were obvious, but Mamie noted it. In a frontier town where every transaction was a potential contest of will, a flat pricing policy was either a philosophical statement or a practical one, and with Jedediah Donnelly she suspected it was both. The first customer came in at 7:20, a farmer's wife named Clara Tanner who needed flour, salt, and thread in 2 colors. Mamie served her efficiently, weighed the flour correctly on the first try, quoted the prices without consulting the ledger because she'd read it twice already, and made change with the ease of someone who'd been doing arithmetic since childhood. Clara Tanner gave Mamie a slightly surprised look as she left, the look of someone who'd expected less and gotten more. The morning was busy. Hays City was a cattle town with a broad hinterland of farms and ranches, and Donnelly's was positioned on the main street in a building with solid construction and good storage, which meant that within its first full week of operation it was already pulling customers away from the older general store down the block purely on the basis of organization and consistent stock. Mamie moved behind that counter with a focused efficiency that she could feel herself settling into. The rhythm of measuring and pricing and making change and writing down requests, the particular satisfaction of a system working the way it was supposed to. Jedediah spent most of the day in the back, receiving a delivery of seed corn and negotiating with a freight driver over damaged goods, and when he came to the counter late in the morning to check the till and the ledger, he stood beside Mamie for a moment reading over the morning's entries. She was aware of his presence in the precise way you are aware of something large and warm standing nearby without turning toward it. "You wrote the full customer name for each transaction," he said. "I thought it might be useful," Mamie said. "If there's a dispute about a purchase, you want to know who bought what and when. Most places just put cash sale and it tells you nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a better system than what I had in mind," he said. "I know," Mamie said. He laughed. It was a short sound, genuine and slightly unprepared, and it surprised her because she hadn't expected it to sound like that, warm and open. She kept her attention on the customer currently approaching the counter, which was entirely appropriate and professionally correct. The weeks settled into a shape that Mamie found she appreciated more than she had expected to. The work itself was good in the way that physical, purposeful work is good, the kind that uses your hands and your mind at the same time and leaves you tired in a clean way at the end of the day. She learned the stock as completely as she'd learned the ledger, so that when a customer described what they needed in vague or incorrect terms, she could translate it accurately into what they actually wanted. She was good with people in the way a person is good with people when they pay attention, not by being warm or soft, but by being genuinely interested in what was required of her in any given interaction. Jedediah noticed all of this. She could tell. He noticed it the way careful people notice things, without making a performance of it. Occasionally, he'd rearrange some system slightly in response to something she'd done that worked better than his original approach, and he never explained or justified the change, just made it, and that was its own form of acknowledgement that she found more satisfying than praise would have been. They talked. Mostly about the business at first, practical exchanges about suppliers and pricing, and the particular preferences of the local customer base. Mamie learned that Jedediah had come to Hays City from Ohio 3 years prior, had spent 2 years working as a freight agent for a supply company operating out of Ellsworth before saving enough to open his own store. He was methodical and forward-thinking in his business sense, already in correspondence with a textile supplier in Kansas City about carrying a wider range of dry goods as the town grew. He had a brother back in Ohio who wrote infrequently, and a mother he sent money to monthly without discussing it. Mamie learned this in pieces, the way you learn anything about a reserved person, through small remarks and incidental facts that accumulate into a picture. She offered her own history in the same measured way. She told him about her father, about the homestead, about the fire that had taken it, a lantern knocked over in the night by her father who had been sick with the fever that took him 2 days later, barely strong enough to stand when he'd risen to check the sounds he'd heard in the night. She told it plainly as a series of events, and Jedediah listened to it the same way, without excess sympathy or the kind of studied gravity people sometimes perform when someone else's loss makes them uncomfortable. "I'm sorry about your father," he said when she'd finished. Just that, clear and real and without embellishment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it equally plainly, and they went back to work. 3 weeks in, she discovered the problem with the feed pricing. Jedediah had set the price for corn feed at a rate that was fair against his cost, but he'd miscalculated what the competition down the block was charging for the same weight, and they were undercutting him by 1.50 cents per pound on bulk orders. It wasn't enough to matter on small purchases, but the ranchers buying in quantity were going down the street instead of to Donnelly's, and the pattern was visible in the ledger if you read it a certain way. She brought it to him on a Thursday evening after the store closed, laying the ledger open on the counter with the relevant entries marked in pencil. She'd worked out the adjustment needed and had written the revised pricing on a separate slip of paper beside the ledger. He looked at the ledger at the slip at her. "You've been doing this in the evenings?" he asked. "After close." "It's not like I'm spending the time on anything essential," she said, which was almost true. The evenings in Mrs. Haverson's boarding house were long and quiet, and the other boarders tended to retire early. "Miss Dugan," Jedediah said, and then stopped. He had this habit when he was choosing words carefully, a small pause that she'd come to recognize. "I hired you to run the counter. What you're describing here is the work of a business partner." The word partner sat between them for a moment. Mamie looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking for a partnership," she said. "I'm telling you there's a pricing problem that's costing you customers. What you do with that information is your business. I just thought it would be useful since it's your business I'm working in and I'd rather it succeed." "Why?" he asked. It was an odd question, direct in a way that was slightly uncomfortable. "Because I'm employed here," she said, "and I'd prefer to stay employed." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the slip of paper with the revised pricing. This calculation accounts for the competitor's current pricing but also for the probability that they'll lower again if we match, he said. You've built in a margin. I have. How did you know they'd lower again? Because Hendricks down the street is the kind of man who measures his success by whether he's beating the next man, not by whether he's making money, Mamie said. He'll lower again. He can't help it. So we need a rate that still works when he does. Jedediah was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the evening sounds of Hayes City drifted through the window. Someone's horse at the rail, voices from the saloon down the block, the distant complaint of a dog. I'll implement this Monday, he said. Good, Mamie said. And I'm adding 15 cents a week to your wages, he said before she could turn away. Don't argue with me about it, it's a business decision. Mamie turned back. She looked at him with an expression she'd been composing carefully, which was one of measured neutrality. I wasn't going to argue, she said. His eyes held hers for a moment, and there was something in them that she recognized without wanting to name, not yet. She looked away first and gathered the ledger and the pricing slip into a neat stack. Good night, Mr. Donnelly, she said. Good night, Miss Dugan, he said. She walked back to Mrs. Haverson's in the cool evening air, and the stars were coming out over the Kansas plain in the particular profusion that you never saw in cities, great sweeping swaths of them. And she stood on the boarding house step for a moment with her head tilted up and felt something she hadn't expected to feel for some time yet, something light and tentative and unwelcome in its inconvenience, which was the earliest outrider of happiness. She told it to mind itself. She had work to do. September came and turned the prairie gold and russet, and the cattle drives wound down for the season as the drovers pushed their herds toward the railhead before the cold set in. The nature of the store's business shifted slightly, more farmers coming in for winter preparations, buying in bulk for the long months ahead. Mamie developed a system for managing the seasonal stock adjustments that she presented to Jedediah in a written proposal, 2 pages of tight, clear reasoning with projected numbers, and he read it once, turned over the second page to look for more, then looked up at her with an expression she was learning to read as a specific kind of impressed. Where did you learn to think like this? He asked. I always thought this way, Mamie said. I just didn't always have anything worth thinking about. He laughed again. It was becoming a sound she looked for, though she managed not to look for it obviously. There was a man named Calvert who came in that September, a land broker with a suit that was too fine for the dust of the town and eyes that calculated everything at a glance. He came in on the pretense of buying supplies, bought a small amount of tobacco and a packet of needles, and spent most of the transaction studying the store's layout and traffic. He came back twice more in the next week, buying small things and watching. On the third visit, he leaned on the counter with the ease of someone who considers himself charming and told Mamie that the owner of this establishment would do well to consider an investment opportunity, and perhaps she'd be so kind as to pass along that Mr. Calvert would be interested in a meeting. Mamie wrote the message down on a slip of paper and passed it to Jedediah without comment. Jedediah read it, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket without visible expression. That evening, Jedediah told her about Calvert. The man was working a scheme that had been running through several of the smaller towns along the rail line, approaching new businesses with an offer that presented itself as investment but functioned as a slow-motion acquisition. He'd taken 2 businesses in Ellsworth the previous year, both owned by men who'd signed agreements they hadn't read carefully enough, and by the time they understood what they'd signed, Calvert held a controlling interest. He's after the store, Mamie said. He's after the corner lot I'm built on, Jedediah said. The railroad is coming through in 2 years. The land my building sits on will be worth 10 times what it is now. Calvert knows that, and I suspect not everyone in town does. Mamie thought about this. What are you going to do? I already wrote to the land office in Topeka for a formal survey confirmation of my deed, he said. And I've sent a letter to a lawyer in Kansas City to review the deed language. He paused, but Calvert doesn't know I know what he's doing, and I prefer to keep it that way for now. You want to play ignorant, Mamie said. I want to appear ignorant, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him for a moment, this methodical, clear-eyed man who thought 3 moves ahead and kept his own counsel and treated her like someone worth consulting. Something in her chest did the thing it had been increasingly doing in his vicinity, which was a kind of quiet warmth that she was running out of ways to rationalize as professional appreciation. "If Calvert comes to the counter again," she said, "I can tell him you're interested in a meeting but very busy. Keep him waiting a week or 2 while you get your paperwork in order. A man like that won't be able to stand the wait. He'll come back 3 more times before the week is out, and each time you'll know a little more about how impatient he is, which tells you something about how solid his position actually is." Jedediah looked at her with that particular expression again. "Yes," he said. "Do that. Anything else?" "No," he said. "That's enough." They stood on opposite sides of the counter in the quiet of the closed store with the lamplight between them, and the moment had a texture to it that was different from the ordinary shape of their days, warmer and more aware of itself. Mamie picked up the ledger and carried it to the back shelf in a movement that was fully practical and not at all an escape. Calvert came back 4 times in the following 10 days, each time with increasing urgency, poorly disguised as casual interest. Mamie managed each visit with the calm friendliness of someone who didn't know anything of significance, and by the time Jedediah's lawyer wrote from Kansas City confirming the deed was airtight, and additionally noting that a formal complaint had already been filed against Calvert in the Ellsworth County Court, Jedediah was in a position to meet with Calvert once, briefly, and make clear with extremely quiet certainty that his business and property were not available in any capacity, and that Calvert's continued presence in the store would be unwelcome. Calvert left Hays City that same afternoon. Mamie heard about it from Mrs. Haverson, who had it from the livery stable operator, who had watched Calvert load his horse and ride east with the specific urgency of a man who has been made to understand that the town has his number. She was eating supper in Mrs. Haverson's dining room when she heard it, and she felt a satisfaction that was genuinely warm and pleased, not the sharp satisfaction of a fight won, but the rounder satisfaction of a problem handled correctly. The next morning Jedediah was already smiling when she walked in, which was unusual enough that she stopped just inside the door. "Good morning," she said. "It is," he agreed. They did not say anything further about Calvert, but the thing between them, whatever it was, had a slightly different quality after that, as though something that had been developing in private had been witnessed by both of them and tacitly acknowledged. October arrived with the first cold snaps, frost on the grass in the mornings, and the sky going pale and high and serious, the way the prairie sky went when it was thinking about winter. The store was busy with the seasonal rush, and Mamie had by this point been working at Donnelly's for just over 3 months, and Jedediah raised her wages to $2 a week as he'd said he would at the 3-month mark, presenting this to her simply as a ledger adjustment. "The store is profitable ahead of my projection," he said. "You've contributed to that materially." "I know," Mamie said, the almost smile. "You're the least modest person I've ever met," he said. "No," she said. "I'm accurate." "There's a difference." "Duly noted," he said. Then, after a pause, "There's a social at the Grange Hall Saturday evening. Half the county will be there." I thought. Another pause. "I thought it might be useful for you to attend, meet some of the farm families, the ones who come in seasonally. Better if they know you by name." Mamie looked at him. He was looking at the ledger with slightly too much focus for a man who had just said something entirely about business. "That does make practical sense," she said. "I thought so." "I'll attend," she said. "Good," he said, and turned a ledger page with the air of a man who has successfully completed a routine transaction. Mamie went back to the counter and waited on a woman buying gingham and thought about the social for the rest of the morning, with the particular discipline of someone trying not to think about something. Saturday arrived. Mamie had no dress suitable for a social, having arrived in Hays City with the dress she stood in, and having since acquired one additional serviceable dress from the second-hand goods at the back of the store. but she had fabric now, and she had a needle and thread, and she had spent her Thursday evening making something that was not extravagant but was proper, a dark blue wool with a fitted bodice and a skirt that moved well. Mrs. Haverson, who had been watching Mamie with increasing interest over the past weeks, pressed the shoulders for her and said she looked fine. The Grange Hall was warm and loud, and full of people Mamie had been serving across the counter for 3 months, who she knew by name and preference and family composition from having paid attention in the way she paid attention to everything. Seeing them in a social setting rather than a commercial one was interesting, the way layers of a thing reveal themselves when the context shifts. She moved through the room with the self-contained ease of someone who has never required a crowd to feel comfortable, speaking to the people she knew, filing away the names of the ones she didn't. Jedediah arrived 20 minutes after she did and crossed the room to her with the kind of directness that she was realizing was simply his nature. He was wearing a dark jacket over a white shirt, and someone had persuaded him to apply some attention to his hair, which was neatly combed though already threatening to go its own way at the edges. He looked, Mamie thought, and then immediately put away, very fine. "You're already working the room," he said when he reached her. "I'm having a conversation," she said. "You're memorizing names and making connections." "I'm doing both," she said. "Is that wrong?" "No," he said. He stood beside her for a moment, looking out across the hall. "I'm not good at this," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the room with a slight tension in his jaw that she hadn't seen in the store, the look of someone performing a task they find genuinely difficult. "You're fine," she said. "I'm adequate," he said. "That's fine," she said. He glanced at her and his tension eased slightly, which she noticed with the careful attention she tried not to let herself give too freely to anything he did. They stayed together through most of the evening, which was largely accidental and also completely not accidental, moving from conversation to conversation, and Mamie found that they worked well together in this context too, his quietness making space for her directness, her presence giving him something to be steady beside. A fiddle player started up near 9 o'clock and couples began to move toward the cleared area of floor. "Do you dance?" Jedediah asked. "I do," Mamie said. A pause. "Would you?" he started. "Yes," she said. He offered his hand and she took it, and they moved to the floor, and the fiddle was playing a reel that Mamie knew from her childhood, something her mother had hummed over a cooking fire in a house that no longer existed in a country she barely remembered. She felt the music in her chest in the particular way music reaches you when you are already a little undefended, and she focused on the steps, which she knew, and on the warm, firm pressure of his hand at her waist and the way he was looking at her, not with the studied admiration of a man performing interest, but with a directness that was very like the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. "You're a good dancer," she said, because he was. "My mother insisted," he said. "She said any son of hers would know how to conduct himself properly in society." "She sounds like my father," Mamie said. "Determined to make something better than what they were given," he said. "Yes," Mamie said. "Exactly that." They looked at each other across the small space between them while the fiddle played, and the hall was full of light and noise and people, and Mamie felt the thing she'd been managing very carefully for 3 months stop being manageable for just a moment. A clear, uncomplicated realization that she was in the process of falling in love with this man, and that it was already further along than she'd admitted to herself. She took that realization and tucked it back into the careful part of herself, where she kept things that required time before they could be properly handled. She smiled at him, not the measured professional expression she used for business, but a real smile, brief and open and honest. He looked at her as though something had changed. Perhaps it had. The music shifted to something slower and they stayed on the floor, and neither of them mentioned that they probably should not have, because it was a social occasion and they had practical reasons for being here that had nothing to do with this. November came in hard and cold off the plains, the wind cutting down from the north with serious intent. The store stayed busy through the first weeks as people stocked up before the cold truly settled. And then there was a quieter period in the middle of the month that Mamie used to reorganize the store's inventory system into something more efficient for the winter stock. She created a secondary ledger specifically for seasonal inventory tracking. And Jedediah, reviewing it one evening after close, told her that it was the best business organization he'd seen outside of a professional counting house. "Where did you actually learn all of this?" he asked, sitting across the counter from her with the ledger between them, which had become their customary way of reviewing the day's business, him on a stool on the backside and her leaning on the counter across from him. "I told you, my father. Your father managed a homestead farm," he said. "That's not the same as this level of accounting." Mamie was quiet for a moment. "Before the homestead," she said, "before we came west, in Ohio, we were in Cincinnati for 6 years. My father worked for a trading company. He kept the books for 3 years before the foreman's son decided he wanted the position and my father was let go." She paused. "He taught me everything he knew. He said it didn't matter that they'd taken the job from him. The knowledge was mine." "He was right," Jedediah said. "He was right about most things," Mamie said. "He was wrong about the homestead. He thought 2 people and 14 acres of Kansas prairie would be enough to make a living, and it almost was some years. Other years it wasn't." "Why Kansas?" Jedediah asked. "Why not stay east?" "Because west was the direction where a man could still decide what kind of life he was going to have," Mamie said. "Or that's what they told us. The reality was harder than the telling." She looked at the ledger without seeing it for a moment. "But I don't regret it. Kansas is real. I know what real feels like now, and I prefer it." Jedediah was looking at her with that steady attention, the kind that was almost physical in its quality, like warmth. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not the way you'd answer if you thought it was the professionally correct thing to say." Mamie looked at him. "All right," she said carefully. "Are you content here?" he asked. "With the work, with the town," a pause, "with the way things are?" She understood that the last piece of the question was about more than the town. She looked at him for a long moment, this cautious, direct, methodical man who thought carefully before he spoke, and who had been treating her like someone worth consulting and worth listening to, and worth looking at from the first day she'd walked into his half-finished store with 14 cents and a chin in the air. "I'm content," she said, "with most of it." He looked at her, and she watched him work through what that meant. "Mamie," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name, and it landed with the force of something formal being set aside. "I would like to ask if I might call on you, not as your employer." "You are my employer," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking if we might be something else additionally." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them cast gold light across the ledger and across his hands, which were folded on the counter with the careful stillness of someone who has asked a question and is serious about waiting for the answer. "I think we might," she said. His expression did something that was not the almost smile and not the full brief laugh, but something between and beyond both, something that was simply, uncomplicated happy. It suited him so well that Mamie felt her own face doing something similar and gave up trying to prevent it. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. The calling on was conducted with the propriety that the situation required, which suited both of them. Jedediah came to Mrs. Haverson's boarding house on Sunday afternoons, hat in hand, and sat with Mamie in Mrs. Haverson's front parlor for the first 2 Sundays before Mrs. Haverson, who had strong practical instincts, suggested that the parlor was stuffy and they might prefer the porch. And thereafter they sat on the porch and talked with the winter prairie spread out before them, cold and pale and enormous under the high white sky. What Mamie discovered in those Sunday afternoons was that Jedediah Donnelly in conversation, when not conducting business, was funny in a quiet way, the kind of humor that came from observing things accurately and saying what you saw without dressing it up. He had opinions that were genuine rather than performed, about the economics of the cattle trade and the coming change as the rangelands were fenced, about the railroad and what it would do to the towns that had built themselves around the cattle drives, about the question of what the Plains tribes were being subjected to in the name of progress, which he said plainly was a taking of what was not ours to take, dressed in language that made it sound like something else. Mamie liked him for saying that. She had seen enough of what had been done to people who were considered to be in the way of someone else's idea of destiny. They talked about Ohio and Dublin and the wide distance between where people began and where they ended up. They talked about books, of which Jedediah had a small but well-chosen collection in the room he rented above the hardware store 2 blocks down from his own business. He lent her a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which she read in 2 weeks and returned with 6 pages of notes she'd written in the margins of a paper she'd brought from the store, and he read her notes with an expression of pure delight. "You argued with the narrator," he said. "The narrator was wrong about 3 things," Mamie said. "On the contrary, I think the narrator was right." "Then you're also wrong about 3 things," Mamie said, "and I'm prepared to explain which ones." They sat on Mrs. Haverson's porch in the December cold with their breath making small clouds in the air, and they argued about a George Eliot novel for an hour and a half, and it was one of the finest afternoons of Mamie's life, which she acknowledged fully and without embarrassment to herself, because she had learned that the things that were fine deserved to be recognized. Christmas came and brought a quiet week in the store and a cold so thorough it made the windows creak. Jedediah gave Mamie a small package on the last day before the holiday, wrapped in brown paper and tied with red string. Inside was a small leather-bound journal with her initials stamped on the cover, MD in gold. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. "For your thoughts," he said. "Since I notice you write things on whatever paper is available, you deserve better paper." She held the journal in both hands and thought about all the things she would never have said about it aloud in that moment, about what it felt like to be seen correctly by someone who paid enough attention to know what she actually needed rather than what seemed like a suitable gift. "Thank you," she said. She had made him something. She'd stayed up 3 evenings to do it, a pair of gloves from the good leather she'd ordered for a customer who'd never come to collect it, stitched in the Irish pattern her mother had taught her, small and particular and impossible to mistake for anything bought at a store. She gave them to him and watched him turn them over in his hands, reading the stitching. "These are remarkable," he said. "They'll keep your hands warm," she said. "You're always losing gloves, I've noticed." He looked up at her. "You've been noticing my gloves. I notice everything in the store," she said. "That's why you pay me." "Right," he said, and he was smiling with his whole face, something she had not seen before, and it undid her completely. January of 1874 was the coldest any of the long-time residents could remember, the temperature dropping to levels that froze the creek outside of town solid enough to walk on, and kept most people indoors for days at a time. The store saw a lull, and Mamie and Jedediah spent several of those quiet days working on the expansion plans that Jedediah had been developing since the fall. He wanted to double the fabric and notion side of the business, bring in ready-made clothing as supply lines improved, and possibly add a small catalog operation to reach the farms that were too far out to come into town regularly. Mamie had thoughts about all of this, which she gave him in writing because that was the form she found clearest for complex ideas. He read them, and they talked through each point with the shared fluency of 2 people who had been thinking about the same problems from slightly different angles, and found that the combination was better than either view alone. One afternoon in late January, with the wind howling outside and the stove in the back of the store working hard against the cold, they were sitting with the plans spread on the counter between them when Jedediah looked up from a page and said, without preamble, in the tone of someone who has been building toward a thing for some time and has decided to stop delaying, "I love you." The wind outside made the windows rattle. The stove ticked. Mamie looked at him. He was looking at her with the directness that was his most essential quality, entirely present and entirely serious and entirely himself. "I know," she said. He waited. "I love you too," she said. "I've been managing it for some time, but I think I'm done managing it." He reached across the plans and took her hand, which was resting on the counter, and held it in both of his. His hands were warm and steady. She looked at their joined hands on top of the catalog plans, which felt like the most accurate representation of them she could have imagined. The business of living and the business of feeling intertwined so thoroughly they were no longer separable. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "But I want to ask correctly, not here over the ledger." "The ledger is where we do our best work," she said. "Mamie," he said gently. "Ask me properly then," she said. "Though I'll tell you now that the answer is yes. I'm telling you so that you don't have to be uncertain about it, because I know you prefer to have the figures in front of you before you make a decision." He laughed, fully and warmly, and squeezed her hand. He asked her properly that Sunday, on Mrs. Haverson's porch in the February cold, with a ring that had been his mother's, sent from Ohio in a small envelope with a letter inside that read, "She sounds like someone worth keeping, Jed, and that is not a thing I say easily," which Mamie read twice, and then pressed carefully into the new journal he'd given her at Christmas. She said yes. Mrs. Haverson, who had been observing all of this with an interest she barely tried to conceal, appeared in the doorway with a pot of coffee approximately 40 seconds after the question was asked, which suggested she had been waiting close to the door with the coffee ready. Neither Mamie nor Jedediah remarked on this, and Mrs. Haverson poured coffee for 3 with an expression of complete satisfaction. They were married in March of 1874, in the small church on the eastern edge of Hays City, on a day when the first suggestion of spring was in the air, a softness at the edges of the cold, the smell of earth beginning to wake. The minister was a dry, earnest man named Reverend Clough, who conducted the service with respectful brevity. There were a dozen people present, Mrs. Haverson and several of the regular customers who had become something like friends, including Clara Tanner, the farmer's wife who had been Mamie's first customer, and who cried quietly and unashamedly through the whole ceremony. Mamie wore the blue wool dress she'd made for the Grange social, pressed and with a new white collar that she'd added, and she carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers that Mrs. Haverson had kept from the fall, tied with the same red string from Jedediah's Christmas package, which she'd saved. Jedediah wore his dark jacket and the gloves she'd made him, just for the walking to and from the church, though he took them off inside. He looked at her when she came up the aisle with the expression of a man who has been dealt an unexpected hand by life and has examined it carefully and found it to be the best one he's ever held. They stood before the minister and made their promises in clear, certain voices, and when Reverend Clough said the words that concluded the ceremony, Jedediah took Mamie's face in his hands and kissed her with a gentleness that was also entirely serious, and the small gathering of people made the warm sounds that people make when they have witnessed something true. They spent their first night as a married couple in the rooms above the hardware store, which Jedediah had been renting and which were cramped but warm and full of the books and accumulated evidence of a life being built. He'd put a jar of wildflowers, dried from the fall, on the small table by the window. Mamie saw them and stopped. "I had Mrs. Haverson find them," he said. "She keeps an extraordinary amount of dried flora." "She does," Mamie said and turned to him. The lamplight was warm and the rooms were quiet with the particular quality of a first evening in a new version of your life, everything familiar in its objects but different in its meaning. "I should tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The day I walked into your store," she said, "I had 14 cents. I'd been turned away from 11 places. I had nothing coming and she paused. I was frightened, not that I would have admitted it to anyone." "I know," he said. "You know. I suspected," he said. "You were holding yourself very straight. When a person is all right, they don't hold themselves that straight." She looked at him. "You didn't say anything. You weren't asking to be seen," he said. "You were asking for work. Those are different things and you knew the difference. I thought you were right." Mamie was quiet for a moment, processing this, the fact that he had seen it and had respected the terms she'd set for the interaction, which was perhaps the most accurately loving thing she could have imagined a person doing. "I almost didn't come in," she said. "I was at the point of being finished with asking. I almost walked past." "I'm grateful you didn't," he said. "So am I," she said. He crossed the room and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him with the particular relief of someone who has been standing in the wind for a very long time and has found something solid. He held her with the same quality she'd been cataloging all these months, steady and real and entirely present, and she felt the last careful guardedness in her chest release itself, gently and completely. The first year of their marriage was full and busy and good. They moved from the rooms above the hardware store into a proper house at the edge of town that Jedediah had been saving toward, a 4-room clapboard with a kitchen garden, and a porch that faced west toward the open prairie. Mamie planted the garden in April, vegetables and a few flowers in the corner, because flowers were not impractical but were in fact necessary, and she told Jedediah this when he looked at the flower corner with a questioning expression. "Everything needs something that isn't purely functional," she said. "Of course," he said, and asked what color she was planting. The store continued to grow. The expansion of the fabric side of the business that they'd planned over the January maps went into effect in May, and the arrival of ready-made cotton dresses and work shirts changed the store's character meaningfully, drawing women from the surrounding farms who had previously had to make everything themselves or do without. Mamie served these women with the particular quality of attention that came from being, not so long ago, a woman who had been making everything herself, and the trust they placed in her was genuine and deep. She knew which fabrics washed well and which didn't, knew which weights worked for work clothes versus Sunday clothes, knew what was worth the money, and said so plainly when something wasn't. The women of the county trusted her judgment the way they trusted the judgment of someone who had no reason to deceive them. By the fall of 1874, Donnelly's dry goods and feed was the most reliably patronized business in Hays City, and word had spread to the farms and ranches within a day's ride. The railroad confirmation came through that autumn, exactly as Jedediah had anticipated, and the announcement that the line would pass directly through Hays City with a new depot put prices in the commercial district into motion. The corner lot Donnelly's occupied tripled in assessed value within a month of the announcement. Jedediah never gloated about having seen it coming, which Mamie thought was one of his finer qualities. He simply reviewed the numbers with her one evening at the kitchen table and said that the position they were in was better than he'd hoped, and that he intended to purchase the lot formally when the estate of the original owner, who had died intestate, was settled. "We should also look at the lot to the north," Mamie said, "for expansion." "The fabric operation alone won't fill it," he said. "No," she said, "but the catalog business might if we set it up properly. Printing costs have come down. If we had even a modest regional catalog for the farm families that can't get to town easily." She stopped. "I've been thinking about it for a while." "Tell me," he said. She told him. The catalog idea had been developing in the back of her mind for months. A simple seasonal listing of goods with clear prices, and a mail-order system tied to the railroad delivery now coming to town. She'd researched what similar operations in the East were doing, found a supplier in Kansas City who was already running a small version of the same thing, and would be willing to act as secondary supplier for items they didn't carry directly. She had a full proposal in the journal he'd given her at Christmas, 3 months of Sunday afternoon thinking committed to the good paper, and she went and got it and set it in front of him. He read it page by page, slowly, the lamp on the table between them casting warm light, and Mamie sat across from him and watched his face do the thing it did when he encountered an idea he found genuinely interesting, a slight widening of the eyes, a stillness. When he finished, he set the journal down and looked at her. "This is a real business," he said. "This isn't a side project, this is a second business." "I know," she said. It would require you to be the one running it, he said. I can't manage the store and this simultaneously. I know that too, she said, a pause. Mamie, he said, do you want to run it as its own operation, separate accounts, your name on the correspondence? She looked at him across the table. He meant it completely, she could see that. He was not proposing a courtesy. He was proposing that she run a business in her own name, which in 1874 in Kansas required a certain kind of man to suggest, and a certain kind of woman to accept without diminishing it. Yes, she said. Then we do both, he said. The catalog business incorporated quietly in early 1875 under the name Dugan Dry Goods Catalog, which Jedediah had suggested specifically, because Mamie should have her name on the things she'd built. And Mamie had looked at the proposed documents for a long moment before signing them with the feeling of something being made right in the world, quietly and without ceremony, but permanently. The catalog launched in spring, a 12-page seasonal listing mailed to every farm and ranch household within 60 miles whose address they could acquire. The response exceeded their projections by the third week. Order letters came in on every mail delivery, some written in careful copperplate, some in the rough block print of a man who rarely wrote letters, some barely legible but entirely sincere. And Mamie read every one personally and filled every order herself until it became clear that the volume required a helper. And she hired a young woman named Dora Hepworth who was 17, the daughter of a carpenter, and who could write a fair hand and count change correctly, and who reminded Mamie somewhat of herself 6 years earlier, sharp and capable, and in need of someone who would treat her work as worth paying for properly. She paid Dora properly. In the summer of 1875, Mamie discovered she was expecting a child. She told Jedediah on a Sunday morning in July, with the windows of the house open and the prairie smell coming in, the particular warm green smell of Kansas in summer, and he received the news the way he received most things of importance, quietly and entirely, setting down the coffee cup he'd been holding and looking at her for a long moment, and then getting up and coming around the table to where she sat and putting his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on the top of her head. "Are you well?" He said. "Are you frightened?" "I'm well," she said, "a little frightened, mostly glad." "Me too," he said. Both things. She kept working. The idea that she would simply stop working had not occurred to her, and to his credit it did not seem to occur to Jedediah either. She adjusted the things that needed adjusting, took more of the counter work off herself as the months advanced and delegated more to Dora, who was growing into the responsibility with satisfying capability, and spent the mornings when her energy was best on the catalog correspondence and planning. In December of 1875, their son was born. He came into the world with the specific opinion of a baby who has decided it is time and intends to be decisive about it. And by the time the doctor arrived, Jedediah had already been the one delivering him, following Mrs. Haverson's calm instructions from the doorway, his sleeves rolled up, and his expression that of a man who has decided to be useful rather than frightened and is succeeding by will alone. They named him Patrick, for Mamie's father. Patrick Donnelly was a loud, determined, red-haired boy who nursed with the enthusiasm of someone who has a great deal of living to get through and is not inclined to waste time. Jedediah held his son in the first hours with an expression that Mamie had never seen on him before, something entirely open and without protection, wonder without reservation, and she filed it in the place. She kept the things she wanted to remember with full accuracy. She went back to the catalog work 6 weeks later, bringing Patrick in a basket to the office in the store where Dora watched over him with great seriousness while Mamie worked. The basket solution had been Mamie's idea and Dora's enthusiastic endorsement, and it worked until Patrick was old enough to have opinions about the basket, which was approximately 4 months, at which point a different arrangement was required, and Mrs. Haverson, whose children were grown and who had been visiting with suspicious regularity, stepped into the role of primary minder with the air of someone completing a plan that had been in place for some time. The town grew. The railroad changed everything it had promised to change, bringing new settlers and new commerce, and a different kind of energy to the streets. Hays City was becoming a real town, not just a trail stop, and the businesses that had established themselves before the railroad arrived were in a position to grow with it. Donnelly's expanded into the North Lot in 1876, and the new space became dedicated to the catalog operations storage and fulfillment, which had grown to cover much of western Kansas and had reached into the eastern edge of Colorado territory. Mamie hired 2 more people in 1876. Both women, one a widow named Frances who had impeccable ledger skills and a dry humor that matched Mamie's own, and one a young man named Thomas who handled the loading and freight coordination, and who turned out to have an unexpected talent for the order logistics that made the whole operation more efficient. She trained all of them the way her father had trained her, completely, and with the assumption that they were capable of the full scope of the work. Jedediah watched her do this with an affection that was not diminished by familiarity. If anything, it had grown more specific, more articulated over the years of their marriage. He knew her completely now, the way you know a person when you have lived alongside them through all their weathers, the early mornings when she was efficient and quiet and needed to be let alone, the evenings when she was more expansive, the particular intensity she brought to a problem she hadn't solved yet, the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, the way she would stop sometimes in the middle of the kitchen garden and stand still in a way that meant she was thinking about her father. They had built something, the two of them, not by accident but by sustained, deliberate, daily decision, each of them bringing what they had and trusting the other to do the same. In 1877, Mamie found out she was expecting again. She was sitting at the catalog desk working through a supplier negotiation in late April when the realization organized itself into certainty, and she put down her pen and sat with it for a moment, feeling the familiar combination of gladness and a slight practical alarm as she mentally reorganized the coming months. She went to find Jedediah in the back of the store where he was meeting with a freight agent. "I need a word," she said. He looked at her face and said to the freight agent, "Give us 5 minutes," with the ease of a man who has learned to read his wife's expressions accurately. In the office space behind the counter, she told him. He sat on the edge of the desk and pulled her close and held her with his face in her hair. "Patrick will be pleased," he said. "Patrick will be jealous initially," she said. "Probably," he said. "He'll manage it." "He will," she said. "He has your stubbornness." "He has yours," Jedediah said. "I refuse to take credit for that one." She laughed against his shoulder, and he tightened his arms around her. And outside the window of the back office, the town went about its business in the summer bright afternoon. The second child came in October, a girl this time, another red-haired, definite-voiced person who announced her arrival with the same decisive authority as her brother. They named her Bridget for Mamie's mother, a woman Mamie remembered in fragments and warmth and the smell of bread and the sound of a tune hummed over ordinary work. Bridget Donnelly grew. Patrick Donnelly grew. Hays City grew. The catalog business grew. Jedediah and Mamie stood over the books each evening and watched the numbers that represented all of it, the work of years rendered in columns of figures, and the numbers were good. There were hard years mixed in with the good ones. 1878 brought a drought that hit the farming community severely and reduced catalog orders sharply, and Mamie responded by extending credit to the established customers, keeping careful records, trusting that people would repay when they could because she had enough experience of hardship to know that hard times did not make people dishonest. They only made people desperate, and if you showed a person trust in their desperate time, they remembered it. Most of them did. A few didn't, but the losses were less than the goodwill gained. And by 1879, when the rains returned, the catalog's customer base was larger and more loyal than it had been before the drought. There were difficulties of other kinds, too. A man who came through Hays City in the spring of 1876 tried to hold up the store at gunpoint on a Friday afternoon when the till was full from the week's trading. He was a young man, probably 20, with shaking hands and eyes that said he'd made a decision he wasn't sure about. Mamie was alone behind the counter. Jedediah was at the back receiving a delivery. She looked at the young man's shaking hands and the old revolver he was holding and made a series of rapid calculations. She put both hands flat on the counter, which was not the gesture of someone preparing to do anything dramatic, and said in a clear, unhurried voice, "I'm going to give you what's in the till. But I need you to understand that the sheriff's office is across the street. There are 2 men visible through that window right now, and if you take this money you will be caught before you've gone 2 blocks." The young man stared at her. "There is work at the feed yard on the south end of town," Mamie said. "Mr. Briggs is short-handed, he told me last Tuesday. He pays 30 cents a day and provides a meal." The young man's gun hand dropped several inches. "I'm going to reach under the counter now and get a piece of paper," Mamie said. "And I'm going to write Mr. Briggs's name and the address of the feed yard on it, and you're going to put that gun in your belt where it isn't threatening anyone, and you're going to leave this store and go find Mr. Briggs." She wrote the note, slid it across the counter. The young man stared at it for a moment, then put the gun away and took the note and left without a word. Jedediah appeared from the back of the store approximately 30 seconds later with a look on his face that said he had been aware of the situation for at least part of it and had made his own rapid calculation, which was that Mamie was handling it and he should not interfere unless it became necessary. "He's gone," he said. "He's gone," she confirmed. "You gave him Briggs's address," Jedediah said. "Briggs genuinely needs help," Mamie said, "and that boy genuinely needed a different direction." Jedediah looked at her for a long moment. "Did you just give a man who was robbing you an employment referral?" "I gave him a business transaction," Mamie said, "same as someone gave me once." He crossed the store and took her face in his hands the way he had at the end of their wedding ceremony, with that same entirely serious gentleness, and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and held on. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said. "I know," she said. They both laughed, leaning together, and the store was warm around them and the afternoon light lay gold on the shelves. Mr. Briggs came in the following week to say that a young man named Wilson had shown up asking for work, and proved to be hardworking and honest, and had Mamie perhaps sent him, because if so he'd like to thank her. Mamie said she was glad it had worked out and suggested Briggs consider keeping Wilson on past the immediate need, and Briggs said he'd been thinking the same thing. The decade turned to the 1880s, and the country around Hays City continued to settle and build. The great open range was changing, fences going up across the land that had once been all horizon, the cattle drives from Texas slowing as the ranches in Kansas and further north established their own herds. The character of the towns changed with the land, becoming less transient, more permanent, the population shifting from the unmarried men of the trail drives to families putting down roots. Donnelly's dry goods and feed adjusted with the changes, as Jedediah had always anticipated it would, moving more strongly toward the family trade, expanding the ready-made clothing line, bringing in an increasing range of household goods as people built homes rather than camps. The catalog business expanded accordingly, and by 1882 it was operating in 5 Kansas counties and had begun a small extension into the Indian Territory to the south, serving the agency communities there. A business Mamie had built carefully and honestly, insisting on fair prices and no inferior goods, and treating the correspondence from every customer with the same careful respect regardless of who they were. Patrick was 6 and Bridget was 4 when the twins arrived in 1882, boys, identical and boisterous, named Liam and Seamus in the Irish tradition that Mamie had decided was hers to honor regardless of how many generations removed she was from Dublin. Jedediah held both babies at once in the first evening, one in each arm, looking between them with an expression of complete amazement. "There are 4 of them," he said. "I know," Mamie said from the bed, where Mrs. Haverson was fussing with blankets in a way that Mamie tolerated because Mrs. Haverson had been part of their lives for 9 years and had earned the fussing. "We're going to need a bigger house," Jedediah said. "I've been thinking about the lot on Maple Street," Mamie said. He looked at her. "You're 5 hours post-delivery. And the lot on Maple Street is still available," she said. "These are not related facts, but they're both true." He laughed, careful not to wake the babies, and came to the side of the bed and took her hand and held it, and his eyes were bright. "I love you," he said. "That is a completely inadequate statement, but it's what I have." "It's enough," she said. "It's more than enough." They built the house on Maple Street in 1883, a proper house with 6 rooms and a wide porch all the way around, and a kitchen garden large enough to grow everything Mamie had decided she wanted to grow, which was considerable. Patrick had a room he considered his domain, and Bridget had a room she organized with the efficiency of someone who had been watching her mother do things properly for 4 years and had taken careful notes. Liam and Seamus shared a room and transformed it into a small disaster area within 48 hours of occupation, and no structural intervention proved sufficient to alter this condition in any lasting way. And eventually, Mamie and Jedediah accepted it as simply the nature of having Liam and Seamus, the way you accept the weather. The porch faced west, as she'd wanted all the porches they'd lived on to face, toward the open prairie that she had come to love with the deep, unsentimental love of a person who understands what they've been given. Kansas in the evening, the sky going from blue to amber to rose to the deep purple that preceded the stars, the wind coming in across the grass with its particular clean, wild smell. Mamie stood on that porch many evenings after the children were in bed, and Jedediah stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and they looked out at the country they had made their lives in. One evening in the fall of 1884, the sky particularly fine above them, he said, "Do you remember the 14 cents?" She looked at him. "Why would you ask that?" "I've been thinking about it," he said. "About the day you walked in. I've thought about it more times than you'd probably expect." She leaned into him slightly. "What do you think about it?" "That everything that exists now," he said, "the store, the catalog, the house, those 4 impossible children, all of it existed as a possibility because you walked in and asked for work instead of help. I've been grateful for your stubbornness every day since." Mamie was quiet for a moment. The prairie wind moved through the grass below the porch. "It wasn't stubbornness," she said. "It was knowing who I was, what I could do. I didn't want someone to give me something I couldn't earn. If it could be earned, I wanted to earn it." "You earned it," he said, "all of it." "We earned it," she said. He turned and looked at her in the way he still looked at her after more than 10 years of marriage, with that same directness and attention, as though she were something he was still in the process of understanding and finding more in each time. "Yes," he said, "we did." She reached up and touched his face. This good and careful man, this particular combination of methodical and warm and quietly funny and entirely serious about the things that mattered. And she thought about a girl who had walked 3 miles across the prairie with 14 cents and her chin up and her heart locked tight with grief and necessity. And she thought about everything that followed. The work and the words and the dancing and the ledgers and the babies and the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life built from scratch on the Kansas plain. "I would do it all exactly the same," she said. "So would I," he said. He kissed her as the last light left the sky, and the first stars came out above the prairie. And behind them in the house, their 4 children made the various sounds of children who had been told to go to sleep, and had their own ideas about this. And the house was warm and full and theirs. And the night settled over the Kansas plain with the immense and gentle thoroughness of a country that had no idea what it had witnessed and no need to know. In the spring of 1885, the catalog business received its 100th letter of the week for the first time, a threshold Mamie had set for herself years earlier as a mark of having made something real. Dora Hepworth, who was now 29 and running the catalog fulfillment operation with the authority of someone who had grown into the full measure of her capability, brought her the letter with the tally sheet and a quiet smile. Mamie looked at the number for a long moment, then set the letter down and went to find Jedediah. He was at the store counter, going over a supplier agreement. She walked in and he looked up, and something in her face told him this was significant. "What is it?" he said. 100 letters this week," she said. He came around the counter and embraced her in the middle of the store in the plain sight of 2 customers who were examining bolts of wool in the corner, and who looked at each other with the small smile of people witnessing something they're glad to see. "Your father would have been proud," Jedediah said quietly, with his chin on her hair. Mamie pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment, letting herself feel that fully. "He would have been extremely proud," she said, "and he would have sat down immediately to calculate the profit margin." Jedediah laughed. "We have that in common." "I know," she said. "It's why this works." She stepped back and straightened her collar and looked at him with all the clear and complete love of 12 years, which was something that had not simplified with time, but had instead deepened and complicated into something that contained everything they'd been through together: the hard winters and the good harvests, the calvert and the drought and the young man with the shaking hands, the babies arriving and the garden growing and the books they'd argued about, and the ledgers they'd built together, and the evenings on the porch facing west. She had walked into his half-finished store with 14 cents and a demand for fair wages and no interest in anyone's charity, and he had shaken her hand and called it business and meant something more, and between those 2 honest transactions everything had grown. The town continued its life around them. Cattle drives were mostly a memory now, the fences having done their work, and Hayes City had settled into the prosperous respectability of a railroad town, with a solid commercial district and ambitions toward a school and a library, and the other institutions of a community that intends to persist. Donnelly's was part of the fabric of the place in the way that a business becomes when it has been there long enough and been honest enough to become something people feel proprietary about. Patrick, at 9, was already spending his afternoons at the store, with the focused interest of someone who understood that this was his inheritance in the most fundamental sense. Not the building or the contents, but the way of thinking and working and treating people. Bridget was building a miniature catalog operation in the playroom, complete with an inventory list and a pricing structure, which Mamie found one afternoon and read with an expression of pure helpless pride. Liam and Seamus were 7 and still causing structural damage to every room they occupied for any significant period, but they were kind boys under the chaos, with their father's attentiveness and their mother's directness, and those qualities would matter more than tidiness when the time came. Jedediah, at 40, had the same essential quality he'd had at 28, the steadiness and the humor and the careful attention, worn smoother now, more comfortable in its fit, the way a good character wears over the years of living it. He had gray coming in at his temples and the lines at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, which was more often than it used to be. He still read everything he could get his hands on and still lent her books and still argued about them across whatever surface was between them. And she still told him he was wrong about things and was still right about half of those times. On the evening of their 11th anniversary, in March of 1885, they sat on the porch of the house on Maple Street after the children were in bed, with the prairie dark before them and the spring constellations clear overhead, and he poured 2 cups of good coffee, which he'd obtained from a supplier in Kansas City at her specific request, because she developed strong opinions about coffee over the years, and handed one to her. 11 years, he said. 11 years, she agreed. Do you have any regrets, he asked. She considered this with the full seriousness she gave to every question he actually meant. I regret that my father didn't live to see Patrick, she said. I regret the drought year for the families it was hard on. I regret not starting the catalog sooner. She looked at him. I regret nothing that touches you. He looked at her with those dark eyes, the lamplight through the window behind them laying a faint warmth across his face. "You are my whole life's best decision," he said. "I walked into your store and told you what I was worth," she said. "You believed me. That's the whole story." "That's the whole story," he agreed. They sat in the comfortable silence of people who have nothing to prove to each other, who have built a life together out of honest work and stubborn love, and the daily practice of showing up for what they'd chosen. And the stars turned slowly over the Kansas plain, and the wind moved through the grass below the porch, and the house behind them held everything they'd made. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what Mamie Dugan, with her 14 cents and her chin in the air and her absolute refusal to accept anything less than what she'd earned, had made it, walking through a door in the summer of 1873 with nothing but what she was and everything still ahead. It had been, from the beginning, purely business, and from the beginning it had been something else entirely. And both of those things were true, and neither would have been possible without the other, and that was the most honest accounting of the whole of it.